When I was 16, I stumbled across a video by Neitstat called Life Explained in 27 Seconds.
Where Neitstat says that life is like going the wrong way on a moving sidewalk. Walk and you stay put. Stand still and you go backwards. To get ahead, you have to hustle.
I had just started shooting films and Neitstat was a hero of mine. One of Casey's reoccurring themes in his videos was to work hard, to get stuff done. It was messages like this that motivated me to spend so many of my days learning how to shoot and edit, and so many of my nights grinding making videos in After Effects and Premiere Pro. I am 22 now, and recently the same video was recommended to me in my timeline. And after watching it again 6 years later, I still think that it is a great analogy for life in a lot of different ways. We're gonna get into it more later into this video, but it's crazy how many parallels that you can draw from things like your ability to run, what sets the speed of the treadmill, what's on either ends of the treadmill. But upon rewatching this video, it also feels a little bit different to me now, and looking at it a little bit closer, I am seeing a lot more of the negative implications of this analogy. But let's extrapolate this analogy a little bit further, because I think there is possibly more meaning to it than what initially meets the eye. So let's dive into what I'm calling the treadmill analogy. First, I'm going to talk about the basics of this analogy, and then I'm going to get more into the fun details and nuances that I've discovered while analyzing it. Okay, let's first talk about the basics. In this analogy, we are all people walking on our own treadmills of our lives. Simply, we can say that the treadmill of life is representative of the various levels of adversity in life, things that are moving against you succeeding. These adversities can come in various forms, but for North Americans, the lack of money is the primary adversity in most people's lives. So that is what I'm going to focus on in this video. Success for most people in North America can be defined as obtaining money in some way or another, and therefore the treadmill moving backwards against us represents the costs of living, which are rent, groceries, gas, going out, anything that you want to spend money on. With this in mind, walking on the treadmill can be compared to earning money, grinding a job, or a passion, working to become successful. And in a lot of ways, the treadmill of life is a lot bigger than Casey's example. We move forward and backwards over our lives on the socioeconomic treadmill, hoping to end up somewhere further ahead than where we started. Okay, you still with me? I have one last basic thing that I will go into much more detail with later, but you may be asking, what's on the ends of this treadmill? When do we get off? Well, you don't. I mean, on one end of the treadmill, you have monetary success. But since there are always costs of living, if you stand still, theoretically, you will eventually get pulled back to the beginning. And on the other side of the treadmill, you have homelessness and extreme poverty, where you are barely still on the treadmill, constantly risking falling off and dying. Okay, so now that we have the basics out of the way, let's get to the fun part. Let's talk about us, the people walking on the treadmill. In general, the person can be described as the financial parts of your life that you have control over. I largely agree with the point that Casey is trying to make in this video. If you stand still, you don't work, the treadmill will start to take you further and further back. If you work a reasonable amount, you'll walk, and if you do more, do overtime, get a promotion, do more valuable work, you will begin to run faster. This makes sense, and I'll raise you one better. I think that this is genuinely fair. But one of the unintentional assumptions that gets made when you make the comparison of people running on the treadmill to us in the real world is that we are all people. Hear me out. Once you work your way up from becoming an employee to a manager to a CEO, your strides on the treadmill become exponentially longer, beyond what even the fastest human in the real world could run. So now let's compare this graph of the average person versus the fastest person in the world, their running speeds, to the salaries of an average person versus the top 1% in the US. And I'm comparing it to the top 1%. I'm being generous. If you want to compare it to top 0.1%, you're looking at an even greater disparity. Once you become somebody who's earning a high 6 to 7 figure income, every step you take takes the average person 10 or even up to 100 steps. Not only are you proverbially getting ahead, you are getting impossibly far away. Casey's example using humans as the characters on this treadmill shows one of the biggest lies that every American tells themselves. That if I work hard enough, if I run fast enough, I can catch up to these giants. It's the idea that we are in a race against an Olympic runner and enough training will get us there. When in reality, we are racing the Flash or a jet. It's this mindset that encourages us, that encourages Casey to hustle. And in very rare cases, like Casey's, it can actually work. But let me ask you this, what if you trip while running? What if you burn yourself out by grinding away at your work too much that, say, you have a panic attack? Or have to quit because it's too stressful? The running that you did to get ahead on the treadmill ends up being useless because you end up sliding back to where you started or maybe even further behind. Casey Neistat's example of running is very effective in this way because you can't run forever, nobody has infinite stamina or energy. But let's even say that somehow you work extra hard and you don't burn out or backslide, that you make it just as Casey has. Don't you think that if you have this heightened stress for a long period of time, are staying up later and getting up earlier, not dedicating enough time to your physical and mental well-being as a result of this overwork, are you now not shortening the length of your life and your treadmill? And even if you don't die earlier, what kind of quality of life is it to run yourself that hard for that long? I don't mean to pick on Casey because genuinely he's one of my idols and one of my favorite creators, but have you seen the bags under this guy's eyes? Have you heard of his ridiculous schedule? Even if we put ourselves in the dream world that anybody who hustles like Casey will have the exact same level of success that he does, is that what we want? Is that even healthy at all? Another false equivalency that gets developed when we assume that the people running on the treadmill are all exactly the same is the discrimination of historically oppressed groups such as different races, genders, and sexuality. A large portion of the gender wage gap can be attributed to pregnancy, an act where you not only stand still on the treadmill and let it take you back for 9 months, but also your male contemporaries get raises and the ability to run faster while you get looked down on as weak. This can also affect any historically oppressed group when the majority of the CEOs are men, majority are white, and majority are straight. And I'm not trying to do the straight white men are evil thing, but you'd be making a difficult argument if you were saying that these factors had zero meaning whatsoever in the hiring and promotion process, all of which can drastically affect the speed that people are able to run. On top of biases in the hiring processes that we have though, any stressors, mental health issues, physical health issues can affect your ability to run fast on the treadmill, no matter what your race, gender, or sexuality. However, historically oppressed groups may have higher amounts of stressors than non-historically oppressed groups. The last thing I want to talk about here on the people aspect of it is the thing that treadmill running truthers will point out. It's that some people are just lazy. Some people don't feel like running ahead, so they don't. And now I definitely don't agree to the extent of which this is true. I will concede that some people are motivated to work hard to run their proverbial treadmill more than others. I think my main point with this category of talking about the people on the treadmill, the question that I want you, the viewer, to ask yourself as I continue on with this treadmill is how fast should you have to run to get ahead? And how slow should you be able to walk to not fall behind? Okay, let's talk about the treadmill. If the person on the treadmill can be described as the parts of your life that you have control over, the treadmill can be generally described as the parts of your life that are out of your control. But to talk about the treadmill, we need to start by discussing where you begin your journey on the treadmill. Because the level of wealth that you were born into has a huge effect on the amount of risk that you're willing to take, what opportunities you may have, what university you can go to, and so much more. People who are born into high amounts of wealth not only start further ahead on their treadmills, but they also have more opportunities to level up their speed through monetary investments in themselves. Studies have found time and time again that the amount of wealth your parents have is the biggest indicator of how much wealth you will have in the future. Generational wealth in this way can be thought of as your children picking up at the same spot on the treadmill that you left off. When thinking about systemic racism or oppression, it makes a lot of sense that people are frustrated that, for example, white people were able to walk the treadmill for hundreds of years while black people were enslaved, and then when they were finally freed, they had to start at the beginning while white people had this major head start. That doesn't mean that you can't be poor and white and that your life isn't hard. But generally, the longer you're able to play this game of life, generation over generation, the more opportunities you'll have to get further and further ahead. Okay, back to the treadmill that everyone runs. I promise this video isn't all about systemic racism or oppression, but it is an important factor when we look at the treadmill that all North Americans run. Now let's talk about what sets the speed of the treadmill: the cost of living. But this cost of living is not the same for every person, and thus we all have different speeds for each of our metaphorical treadmills. Now, there are a myriad of factors that determine the speed of the treadmill for each individual. You have a choice to control some of these factors, such as living in a less expensive area, spending less going out, buying less subscriptions, or eating less fast food, which can all slow down your treadmill. But there are a lot of other bigger reasons outside of your control that can change the speed of your treadmill, such as your rent, groceries, gas, bills, taxes, things that are at the behest of your landlord, inflation, OPEC, the government. These things are pretty much completely out of your control and kind of act as a minimum speed that you'll have to walk/run against. Let's say that you're living at home for the first 5 years out of high school. At home, you don't pay rent or buy groceries, which are some of the most expensive costs of living. You then have the opportunity to run ahead due to the slow speed of your treadmill, so that when you do move out, you have much more room to trip, fall, stand still, pursue anything that you want. Compare this to somebody who is moving out right out of high school. They are closer to the beginning of their treadmill, and a simple mistake early can land them in a lot of trouble, making them go into debt, lose their home, lose their job, and ability to walk on the treadmill at all. Okay, so the speed of the treadmill can be different for different people. Now what? Well, not only can the speed of the treadmill be different for different people, different parts of the treadmill can also be moving at different speeds. Now, this is most obviously true when you look at multimillionaires whose money through investments is actually enough for them to live on exclusively without working. In this way, their treadmill begins to actually move forward for them instead of backwards against them. But the same principle stands for everyone in varying positions on the scale. The more money you have, the more you are able to invest, the easier it is to buy a home, something that you can either sell for a higher price, sending you forward on the treadmill, or rent out to people as passive income, which either will slow down your treadmill or begin to allow it to actually move forward for you. The poorer you are, the further you are back, the less means you have to slow down your treadmill via investing in your future in any way. Not only do you have less income when you are poor and less ability to run faster, the treadmill can also be faster for you than someone much wealthier. And while there are factors that speed up the treadmill for people who are wealthier, like getting taxed at a higher rate or spending more the more you make, I don't think that this is a one-to-one proportional increase. In general, the cost of living of someone making $60K a year is not double the cost of living of somebody making $30K a year. So while the cost of living does get higher and your treadmill will move faster, people who have more wealth are able to offset this faster moving speed in the form of investments to a point where they can even have a slower treadmill compared to somebody who is making much less. And don't get me wrong, at the beginning, and I mean the very beginning of the treadmill, at critical levels of poverty and homelessness, we do have systems like welfare that slow down people's treadmills to some extent, so they are able to get back on their feet. But in general, the treadmill seems to get faster and faster relative to you the closer you are to the beginning. So to recap this point, we are currently in a system, a treadmill, that can sometimes be even faster for people further back on the treadmill, despite their inability to run as fast as people further up. And through investments, the people very far up can actually reverse their treadmill so that they don't have to run or walk at all. It's really weird that we have a shrinking middle class. The American dream. I really like this treadmill example because I think that the American dream, the idea that you can build yourself into anything that you want to be, is a faulty concept. It's interesting that the metaphor most used to describe social mobility is a ladder, implying that if you stop climbing and working at becoming successful, you'll just stay where you are. When in reality it is more akin to building yourself up as quickly as you can while there's someone underneath you with a hammer trying to tear you down. Hopefully you can build faster than they can tear. The sad reality of the American dream for most people as it stands right now is to intermittently walk/run up this treadmill of life over your lifetime, trying not to get too burnt out in the process. And then as you do this, you can gradually get ahead, relatively, and eventually you are able to reach a point where you're able to stop and retire. To work hard enough over your whole life so that you can stand still for the last 20 years. But this doesn't mean that the treadmill stops moving. The concept of retiring is just timing it just right so that you're able to drop dead, hopefully before you reach the beginning of the treadmill and run out of money. Isn't that inspiring? Compounding on top of this failed American dream narrative, many people fear that we are increasingly living in a system where the minimum speed to walk is increasing more and more for especially low-income people. Due to rising inflation not matching rising wages, you no longer can get by working a minimum wage job anymore. The cost of living, and therefore the baseline minimum speed for most people's treadmills, is on the rise. Instead of being able to walk to get by anymore, now you have to jog, and maybe eventually you'll have to run. And on top of that, there are rising housing prices, which are not allowing people to invest in themselves to slow down their treadmills. It's one thing to acknowledge that we have a treadmill that over time shrinks the middle class on its own, but then compound onto that external factors like inflation, rising costs of real estate, and a fluctuating macroeconomic environment that only serve to further slice apart this middle of the treadmill. And you begin to realize how understandable it is that people are concerned. Social mobility. Okay, we are deep into the video enough. I can take off the clickbaity veil of this video being about how treadmills are like life. We are really talking about the lack of social mobility in North America and what has caused it. We have people starting much further ahead than others. We handicap the running speed and starting places of historically oppressed races, sexualities, and genders. We set different speeds for different people based on where they're born. We make it easier to run faster the further along on the treadmill you get, and lie to people telling them that if they run fast enough they can make it to the end, leading them to burn out and trip and fall towards the beginning. The reality to me is that most people recognize the lack of social mobility, the ability to go from one end of the treadmill to the other, as a real, true problem, left or right. Generally, I see the conservative position is to slow down the treadmill slightly for everyone by reducing taxes, which mostly affects the rich, but then to focus our cultural and societal efforts on building up the individuals, the people walking and running the treadmills, to be the best runners that they could possibly be. I see the liberal position, when not bogged down by unnecessary bureaucracy, as saying that everyone is already the best runners that they can be. Let's slow down the treadmill, particularly for the people closest to its beginning, so that people can progress. Conservatives say focus on people, liberals say focus on the treadmill. I'll let you decide what you think is the more efficient method. Regardless though, I kinda hate the premise of the treadmill to begin with. This may be ironic considering I just spent the last 20 minutes talking about it, but one of the most interesting, telling things about Casey Neistat's video wasn't even the video itself. It was the title. Life explained in 27 seconds. It's this tendency that us North Americans have to make our life about the grind and define our success in life by how much money we can earn and how far along the treadmill we can get. I'm sure it wasn't intentional for Casey, but this video, in the context of the thousands of motivational videos by the likes of Andrew Tate, Joe Rogan, David Goggins, and so many more, become this monotonous scream telling you to work harder and that you're walking, you're not running. These types of motivational videos can lead people not only to burn out, but completely miss the meaning of life to begin with. I think we all know that money doesn't equal happiness, but I think that through running this treadmill our whole lives, it's hard to focus on anything else. Everyone is just plopped on this treadmill the day they turn 18, and then we start to notice that the treadmill begins to move backwards, so we naturally, instinctively begin to walk against it. But nothing about this is natural or instinctive. When we spend so much of our lives focused on just walking the treadmill, we can barely even begin to scratch the surface of finding true happiness or purpose. And I'm sorry if I'm beginning to sound too hippie spiritual for you, but I really believe that this thing that we are all chasing at the end of the treadmill isn't real happiness. So if you are somehow able to jump through the hurdles, to not trip, to sprint to the end of the treadmill of life that Casey Neitstat describes, you will be successful, but you wouldn't have lived. And I think the more important lesson than learning that the American dream is unachievable is that the American dream isn't worth chasing to begin with. And I don't know the meaning of life, and I am also acutely aware that you have to work and be on the treadmill of life whether you like it or not. But I still think that meaning, true meaning, won't be found anywhere on the line of this treadmill towards financial success. It's somewhere else. My name is Jonah. Thank you for watching.